Hello everybody, and hello and welcome to the 6th Topical Science Forum, Making More with Less, How Do We Feed the World as the Population Soars? I'm Ross Smith, I'm the President of Science and Technology Australia, and we're very pleased to be able to bring you a terrific panel of speakers today, although we are just waiting for one, who we hope will be able to turn up very shortly. The aim of this series is to tackle the big issues, and it really doesn't come much bigger than how we feed the world as the population rises. This forum is one of a series of 10 we're presenting this year, and we're very pleased to be in partnership with the Crawford Fund for this one, who many of you will know have an outstanding record in this critical area. But before we begin, I want to thank Inspiring Australia program of the Federal Department of Industry who fund this project and who are actively involved in helping us make this series as good as it can be. We like to make these forums as interactive as possible, so there'll be plenty of time for questions and there will be microphones, so if you could, and we are filming this event, so please wait until the microphone comes to you before you fire away with your questions. And for those who are connected to social media, if you'd like to take part in the conversation via Twitter, please use the hashtag #FeedTheWorld, and we encourage you to do so. So now all that remains is for people to turn your mobile phones to silent. We don't want you to turn them off, obviously, because we'd like you to be tweeting. And I'll hand over to Genevieve Jacobs from ABC 666, who is going to, sorry, I trickled over my feet then, to introduce the panel. Thanks very much, Genevieve.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ross. Hello, welcome to you all. I'm Genevieve Jacobs from 666 ABC Canberra, where I present the morning's program. And like some of you who've been to a number of these events this year, I've learned a great deal through Science and Technology Australia. It's been a fascinating year of discussions thus far. And today is no exception as we look at the role that science has to play in dealing with the challenge of world hunger. Now, of course, there have been plenty of answers advanced to this particular issue in the past, not all of them necessarily successful in the longer term. Will our new answers, the likes of genetic modification, highly industrialised food growing systems, prove any more durable? And what about us here in Australia? What are our responsibilities towards ourselves, the world, our neighbours? Joining me on the panel this afternoon are three people who are very well placed to explore these issues. On the far left, John Kerin will be remembered by anyone with farming connections for his highly regarded role as Australian Primary Industry and Overseas Development Minister in the Hawke and Keating government. Since his retirement from politics, he's served widely with peak bodies in the agricultural and development sectors, including the CSIRO, the Australian Meat and Livestock Corporation and UNICEF Australia, and he's chaired the Crawford Fund board since 2010. Next to him, Professor Catherine Bertini, who's been a transformative leader of the UN World Food Programme. She led efforts to end famine in North Korea, to avert starvation in Afghanistan and ensure that food was delivered effectively during crises in Bosnia and Kosovo and prevent mass starvation in the Horn of Africa. She was the 2003 World Food Prize laureate for her leadership at WFP in ending famine and decreasing hunger. She's also served widely on humanitarian missions for the UN, and in her home country, the US, worked on issues ranging from food packages for breastfeeding mothers to the design of the food guide pyramid. Our latecomer, Dr. Elizabeth Finkel. We're delighted that you're here, Elizabeth, because we were about to start without you, but it's much better with you here. Thank you so much. Elizabeth is the chief editor of Cosmos magazine, working with both scientific and lay audiences. Her book, Stem Cells, Controversy at the Frontiers of Science, won the Queensland Premier's Literary Award, was shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Award and the Australian Government Eureka Prize for promoting the public understanding of science. And that's very much where her interests lie, at the intersection of the professional and the public discussion of these issues. Her second book, The Genome Generation, was published in January 2012. As Ross said, we'll have a couple of microphones around the room. I have some questions for the panel first. I'll begin, but then I'd like to turn the discussion over to you. And in my experience, Canberra audiences are very well primed indeed for these discussions. But as Ross said, please raise your hand to get my attention. We'll get one of the roving microphones to you. Be patient. Sometimes this takes a little time, but we do endeavour to farm the microphone out as fairly as possible, and I'll then let you loose with your questions. But Catherine Bertini, let me begin with you. What is hunger?
Hunger is when a person does not have enough food to be able to live a healthy life. And unfortunately, there are still many people, approximately 870 million people around the world, who are desperately hungry every day.
What are the causes of that hunger? Why do people experience hunger in the first place?
They're poor. Poverty and hunger are totally interrelated. Of course, some people are cut off from food because of war and natural disaster, but the people who are chronically hungry are poor people who cannot afford to be able to have the land to work them, to grow their own food, or to work to get themselves in a position that they're not hungry.
John Kerin, what are the consequences of that hunger for economic well-being, for fulfilling potential in those countries where hunger is experienced?
Well, they just simply don't achieve their potential. Food is basic, it's primal, and if people are not being fed, there is stunting, there's less brain development in children, and it just holds the whole countries back.
And by contrast, John, how do we define food security?
Well, it only not includes sufficient food, but also more and more, it's nutrition as well, and that's becoming more and more important. Roughly, there is about 78, 90 poor, really hungry people in the world, but there's probably 2 billion don't get sufficient micronutrients.
The Nobel laureate for economics, Amartya Sen, says that famines don't occur in democracies. So what level of responsibility does Australia have to the hungry of the world if famines caused not so much by food shortages but by political conditions?
Well, I just think it's an international obligation. Australia was one of the founding members of the Food and Agricultural Organisation of the UN. We are a very small country in terms of population, but I think early on we've always assumed that we do have some international responsibility. And because agriculture is one of the things that we're reasonably good at, and the reason for that is basically our agricultural researchers, our agricultural scientists. We see that this is a way that Australia can help the world, because research is probably one of the best ways to get people out of world food insecurity. And we have a great expertise in this country, and we are well placed, and it also gives us benefits because our scientists get experience overseas. And there's one thing, we don't have any indigenous plant and animal species. We rely on species from all over the world, and we have particular obligations for countries in our region, I would suggest.
You could also argue, though, John Kerin, that hunger is a factor here in Australia. If we look at, for example, remote Indigenous communities where sustaining food is in short supply and it's very expensive, that fits under a definition of hunger, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, and I'm sure this audience is well aware that just money is not going to solve that. That's a very deep problem. We see the intervention in the north and actually guiding people how they should spend their own money, which is a little bit invidious to some people, but it just exemplifies how very, very difficult that situation is, because in all of these things, culture, religion, behaviour comes into it. And we have poor white people in this country, but then again, there are other developing countries that also have racial groups that are discriminated against and do less well.
Catherine, you wanted to comment?
If I could add, just because a country is industrialised and well off doesn't mean that everyone has enough food to eat, and unfortunately that is the case in many countries, including the United States. The difference, however, is that it's our national responsibility, first of all, to do something about people in our own country, but second of all, because the people, presumably in Australia, certainly in the US, who are hungry, may be hungry for a long time, may be generational, but it is not the desperately hungry poor that I described before, those statistics are for people who don't have anywhere near enough to eat, don't even have a meal a day, don't have any kind of access to food on any sort of regular basis. And so generationally, they are hungry because of a 16-year-old girl who gives birth to a baby when the 16-year-old never was properly nourished is not going to have a healthy baby. And then to John's point, that the critical time in a person's life is from conception until age 2. And that is the time when, if they don't have enough food, they will never make up the difference.
Elizabeth Finkel, what kind of effect can we expect a changing climate to have on global hunger?
I think the science was a little bit ambiguous for a while, because with rising levels of carbon dioxide, some plants are actually going to do better. Plants evolved at a time when carbon dioxide levels were higher. But on the other hand, we're going to see unpredictable and changeable climatic patterns. Some areas of the world are going to get too much rain, some are going to get too little. And generally, crops are fairly spoilt critters. They like it just so. They're adapted to particular conditions. And the latest report showed that the predictions are pretty much that yields are going to go down a few percent.
And that's really at its heart about changeability, isn't it? We've had, as you say, a lot of discussion about, well, plants thrive with increased CO2 levels.
Yes, yeah.
But that would imply that those levels were somehow stable, and what we're looking at is a vastly changing climate.
Well, yes, carbon dioxide levels will probably be good for plants. There might be, some situations where they're not, because they can also increase levels of cyanide in some plants, which will be a problem. But the main problem will be the changing weather. And overall, the latest estimates are, and a very growing consensus that is going to be detrimental to yields.
Which areas might be most vulnerable as a consequence of that change? Or I think southeastern Australia is among them, isn't it?
Yes, southeastern Australia, I think Western Australia.
Yeah.
I think, look, I can't reliably recall it off the top of my head. Sorry.
But we're experiencing the possibility
yeah.
of significant change to areas which have got sustainable agriculture now.
Yes.
That comes under risk as a consequence of climate change.
Yes.
Yeah. John Kerin, technological solutions were advanced post-war for many of these issues, and we look at things like the Green Revolution, but we know that some of those technological solutions have had profound consequences. We look at things like fertiliser runoff, water table issues, salinity. Manipulating land to grow more foods isn't necessarily a straightforward solution or a sustainable one, is it?
Yes and no. I know it's an economist's answer, but you'd think by now we knew all we need to know about water. Just take that. But the more we know, the more we find we need to know more. If you look at food production in this country, we are growing more with less land, we're growing more with less water, we're growing more with less chemicals, and that is also part of the solution to some of the problems we have. So again, it's the application of known technology, which is one of the things the Crawford Fund is so intent on, and it is also applying the high level knowledge we can keep on getting by expending money on research.
Well, industrial scale food production is also reliant on mechanisation, and so that makes it vulnerable to oil prices, to petrol as well. There are some questions to be answered there, aren't there, about large scale industrialisation being an answer to this?
Yes, but large-scale industrialisation can also bring cheaper food. So, when I say nothing's just absolute, and horticulture is scaling up quite remarkably, and a lot of forms of agricultural production are scaling up and will scale up. Now, the cost of energy is one of the main problems for agricultural production in our country and others. But then again, that's a question of price. Now, if the world becomes less food secure, the price will rise, and perhaps that will provoke more technology and more science. But it doesn't matter which way you go, unless you continue to expend on relevant research, blue sky as well as applied, we won't beat it. Now, I'm not a technological determinist, but it is so important a part of what we need to do that I just think one of the last thing you should cut in any budget, in my opinion, is expenditure on research and education.
And Catherine Bertini, I'd be interested in your take on that, whether you agree with what John's suggesting there. When we look at the results of the food revolutions post-war, for example, there's a disruption of low-tech food production mechanisms. There's a reliance, for example, on artificial fertilisers that's not necessarily beneficial in the long run. I just wonder whether there is a role here for looking towards more integrated, locally focused solutions that rely on traditional knowledge. Does that factor into your thinking as a solution, or is that wishful thinking?
No, it's not wishful thinking at all, and it's got to be a combination. There have to be researchers and experts in various places that can look at a broader picture and bring information and technological advice that that people at a local level wouldn't have the capacity to do. But at the same time, if there's not a strong attention paid to listening to people at local level about what is really required, then any of the money spent on research, and I agree with John, it's a very important priority, but any of that money is really not well spent if there's not attention paid to directing that to people at the local level. For instance, if you're going to develop a new crop that you think would be particularly useful because it's got many more nutrients in it, it's very important to discuss with cooks and with farmers who might be planting and who might be cooking that particular food about what their needs are, because if you spend years developing this and then nobody wants to cook it because it takes longer to cook, which means more water, which means more firewood, or because it doesn't taste acceptable to the local palates, then it's a waste. So it's got to be a balance.
Well, and I think if we look at things like microcredit, for example, which has been about giving people access to finance and basic opportunities at ground level rather than refinancing entire nations, that there's something to be learned from that approach of starting from the ground up.
Sure. I think Bangladesh is a good example, not far away, where the country 30 years ago was desperately poor and where microfinance really got much of its beginning through the Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus, and that plus the strength of NGOs like BRAC have made a huge difference exactly from, as you say, the bottom up, but from women throughout the country who have invested in their own families and their own communities, and the incidence of maternal and child malnutrition and mortality have decreased dramatically.
Elizabeth Finkel, let's look at our own capacity here in Australia. Is Australia capable of becoming an increasingly large food producer? And we look here too to the genetic modification debate, which has been a key to our own approach to technology.
Look, I think that is the answer to that comes on several levels. For instance, the northwest of Australia, since the 1950s, there's been plans that there's so much water there, we ought to be able to develop that area. But when you look more closely into it, the infrastructure isn't there, the irrigation isn't there, so it's not as straightforward as it might seem. And then when you look more closely at what the needs of Asian countries might be, as we heard yesterday in the forum, just simply flooding them with more wheat and rice or more beef is probably not what they need. But as one of the speakers pointed out, there's an opportunity in India. They're vegetarians by and large, and we produce wonderful fruit and vegetables. So that might be an opportunity. And our dairy industry might be another opportunity. So I think looking at it strategically, but then factoring in the environmental impacts, and then I think our industries need more investment to be cost effective. That's what I'm understanding, a lot more R&D so that they can compete on the world scene where Australia is at a bit of a disadvantage because of our costs of production. But I just wanted to go back to your previous point about industrialisation of agriculture, intensification, and the bad name that's gotten. In this issue of Cosmos, if I can just show, we had we took the advantage of Norman Borlaug's 100th birthday, which was this March. And Norman Borlaug, for those of you who don't know, was the father of the Green Revolution. And the zeitgeist at that time was not dissimilar to what we've got now. The 60s and 70s books were being written by people like Paul Ehrlich that basically said Asia, India in particular, is going to starve. there's nothing we can do about it. There were even suggestions, stop, giving foreign aid, it's pointless, just let Malthus do what's necessary. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen because of the agricultural intensification that came about through Norman Borlaug's new high-yielding varieties of wheat and the use of fertiliser and irrigation. And so we avoided millions and millions and millions of people starving to death. Who knows how many, the estimate's going to the hundreds and hundreds of millions. We avoided generations of children being born stunted. Somehow the world forgot that. And now, to the extent that people are aware of the Green Revolution, they see it as the beginnings of sowing the seeds of all that's bad about agriculture. And as Robert Ziegler, who's the head of the International Rice Research Institute, he wrote a wonderful essay at the beginning to say that our aim in the Green Revolution was to get us over this crisis. And we knew that agriculture would have to change. And indeed, if you look at modern agriculture now, its mantra is sustainability. It's about precision agriculture. Farmers have to make it economically. Of course, they want to use fewer inputs, and that's good for the environment as well as an overall greater awareness of environmental sustainability.
John Kerin, I just wanted to go to you on the question of how you respond to the way the genetic modification debate has unfolded in this country. There's been a lot of passion on all sides. What do you think we've made of it here?
Well, my short answer, I think there's a lot of nonsense around about it. We have genetically modified drugs that for various ailments, and we don't say a word about that. And it is an answer to some problems, particularly with respect to health. There's golden rice, which potentially will save 500,000 children from going blind each year. Anyone that worries about canola now, well, sorry, the horse has bolted well and truly. I don't know how many millions and billions of meals have been served involving canola, but no one has found any evidence yet for any bad effect. And it is part of the solution. I'm not saying it's any great solution, but the application of genetic modification is something that should be contemplated. It's very hard with some crops. We are dependent on about 5 main cereals in this world for most of our energy intake. And unless we are serious about continuing research and science and safe science, well, we'll be denying ourselves opportunities. It's as simple as that. I have been involved, I'm only a layperson, but in many areas I've chaired 6 cooperative research centres, and wherever we've touched on genetic modification, we know, if you say a word about it, you'll have all sorts of trouble, you'll spend your time answering nonsense letters. But when we test it, in one case, we tested 70 million crosses and found no problem. This is high science just to prove stuff that we knew already. So I don't want to be too blatant about it, but there's a lot of nonsense around.
Are the questions, though, not so much perhaps about the science itself or its application? If we're considering access to food in developing countries, is what we should be asking ourselves whether GM restricts access to the means of production, restricts access to seed, for example?
Well, I don't see that. And the Crawford Fund and ACR and the International System of Agricultural Institutions is concerned mainly about mainstream food. Now, at the margin, GM will be something that will be developed in the more developed countries and become more applicable. But, I think the main challenge is still to produce more food. And what came out of the Crawford Fund conference these last day or so is that, the big figures are real. We have to increase our food production at least by 60% by 2050.
Elizabeth Finkel, have you seen that debate develop differently in Australia by contrast with other developed nations that are looking at genetic modification?
I think, the broad issues are similar. I mean, it's like you could open a can and pull out all the objections to GM food. They're not safe, they're bad for the environment, they restrict farmers' access, they allow multinational domination. It's amazing how that sort of meme has travelled. I think the response differs in intensity. So France and many European countries have banned the cultivation of genetically modified crops against the advice of their own European Food Safety Authority. And the movement is very vehement. There's even been a recent call to cancel the position of the chief scientific advisor by 9 NGOs. So I don't get it. America seems to be somewhere, probably in the middle, and Australia possibly a little bit more extreme than America, as far as I can tell. I think a recent survey I saw suggested that Australian attitudes might be softening compared to a few years ago, where people were uniformly, when surveyed against GM, now it's something like 50% think it would be okay. If I could just come back to another point about GM crops. Apart from yield, I think the real poster child here is what it's done as far as pesticide use. So cotton uses an enormous amount of pesticide, more than any other single crop. And one of the developments has been in GM to give cotton a gene that bacteria produce, BT, and it reduces the need to use other sorts of pesticides. So BT is an organic pesticide. Organic farmers use it. They'll sort of grow up their vats of bacteria and then spray BT on. The technology has allowed the BT gene to be put into these crops. And what it's meant is that in Australia, the pesticide use in the cotton industry has been reduced by 80%. In India and China, it's been reduced by 50%. And in India, it's particularly important because they're still using extremely toxic pesticides that in Australia, we're not allowed to use. So it's seen reductions of poisonings. 2.3 million farmers each year are not being admitted to hospital for poisoning. So enormous gains there, you'd have to say.
I think that's very much the case with cotton. I think it's less certain with other crops. Roundup-ready technology for canola, for example, we're really not entirely clear about the absolute consequences of large uses of glyphosate, and there have been reports in other countries, I think in the Netherlands, for example, where the water table's very close to the surface, that there is the possibility of residual glyphosate. And so we don't understand every consequence for every crop of the genetic modification process.
Sure, and look, I think agriculture is a struggle. There's nothing natural about agriculture. So you're in a sort of survival of the fittest. You're fighting weeds, you're fighting insects, you're fighting the climate. And show me one form of agriculture that's ideal. If you think organic is ideal, organic also uses chemicals like sulphur, will also lead to the runoff of nitrogen and phosphate into the waterways. No form of agriculture is ideal. What I don't understand is the battle. You don't see scientists in their labs or anybody getting up there and trying to put an end to organic farming. And modern agriculture is extremely integrated. If you go to any of the research institutes now, you'll see a multiplicity of methods being used. And the International Rice Research Institute is a great example. There they will have one scheme which involves just using insects to control other insects in rice paddies, and that's Jeff Gurr, a scientist at Charles Sturt University here, is leading that program with great success. But they'll also have strategies using genetic modification or conventional. I think Catherine Bertini talked about not the green revolution, but the rainbow revolution. Let everybody offer farmers the technologies that will suit them. Why are we having these pitched battles? I'd like to know what's in it for Greenpeace, for instance, to perpetuate these battles when all the world's food safety authorities have said that GM crops are safe, when we can see that in India it's helping the poorest of the poor farmers increase their incomes manyfold because they're not having to spend as much on pesticides. They spend a little bit more on the GM seed, but they're making more profits. And farmers aren't stupid. That's why greater than 90% of these poor Indian farmers are buying the GM cotton. So I don't get it. I really don't get it.
I'm going to turn over to questions from the audience in just a moment. So if you want to put your hands up, we'll get a microphone to you. Lots of questions. But John Kerin, a comment from you?
I can make a point. There's always trade-offs. I'd like to have gene-free and chemical-free food, but you can't get it actually. And once you talk about glyphosate, a lot of research is going on because there is glyphosate resistance in our cereal growing. Now, if that chemical goes, and there's not many others being invented, we're into a whole lot of research, we'll either won't grow wheat or be back into till, and we'll lose our soils. Yeah. Now, the trade-off is quite large. It's not something we can really speculate about. And when you talk about us producing more, sure we can. It'll depend on price, it'll depend on exchange rate, it'll depend on a lot of things. So at any stage, when you're looking at agriculture, there are many balls in the air that you have to balance, and there are always trade-offs, whichever way you go.
Okay. Look, let's now go to some questions from the audience. And who's got the microphone? We'll just go here first. Thank you.
Oh, hello. Thank you for an engaging discussion. Just with the grains, the majority of the world's grains today are actually grown to feed the livestock that are then slaughtered to feed the world's insatiable appetite. And the meat and dairy industry are responsible for not only being the major contributors to the demise of climate change, but also they use the largest amount of water for any industry. So I think the elephant in the room here is to make food more available. Is it time that we take on the UN recommendation? They published a report in 2010 that the world move towards a plant-based diet.
I think that's an interesting question. Catherine Bertini, in this country we're very used to having meat abundantly on our plates, access to foodstuffs that are well beyond the developing world and environmentally costly perhaps. Let's just address that question of whether it's patterns of consumption in the developed world that are partly to blame here.
Sure. Let's go back to the hungry people again, and the people who are desperately hungry, who can afford almost no food. If you progress up the ladder, if you make about $2 a day, which makes you still hungry, but not in that desperately hungry category, you start expanding your choices of food, because when you have almost no choice, you eat whatever is available. So if you make about $2 a day, then you start expanding your food a bit. By the time you get to $10 a day, you actually want and can afford a large variety of food, which means more protein, which ends up meaning more fish or meat, and hopefully more fruit and vegetables, but it's not necessarily mean that in as large scale as it means the protein from fish and meat. So as countries become better off and their citizens become better off, then a larger number of the population actually seek these other kinds of food, which then does what the questioner just described, which requires more grains to produce more meat, fish, so forth. When we take that as one piece, yes, developing countries are playing and will play in the future a very significant role to the increase in consumption of these foods. I remember one time when President George W. Bush was in India, and he was talking about the future food needs, and he said, for instance, in China and India, there's much more consumption of meat and fish-based protein, and that's one of the reasons why there are increased food needs, and the Indians were furious with him because, well, what about your use of grains for fuel? And doesn't that, you're just passing off the excuse on someone else? But in fact, this is one of the reasons why there's increased food need, increased incomes. So the good news is increased incomes. What's key, though, is that we go back to issues like horticulture and growing of fruits and vegetables and making all of those kinds of foods more available. That is more problematic in large part, in part because of the shelf life, because of the transport, because of refrigeration, because of all sorts of other infrastructural needs that are not necessarily available in developing countries. But is that a goal, that we increase availability of those kind of foods for the world? Absolutely, because it's also a good nutritional goal.
I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because if we look at a system like the United States, for example, where the industrialised food chain is one that goes, that permeates everything from soybean production through to corn, through the production of beef, and farmers in that situation often actually miss out because they don't have diversified markets. They're part of a system that locks them into food production that's not actually particularly beneficial for anyone except those at the very top end of the marketing chain.
Yeah, true. And up until recently in the U.S., there were a lot of subsidies for the growing of grains, but not necessarily for the growing of anything else. I've been part of a group of people who have been encouraging our legislators for a long time to give up on the subsidies altogether and instead have some sort of crop insurance to be able to help farmers who are hit by bad weather, for instance, and have that be broad-based, not just for crops, but not just for grains, but to have it also be for vegetable farmers and for fruit farmers, and that over the long term, hopefully, that will shift the balance in some cases of what's produced.
John Kerin, that'd be a great idea, wouldn't it, if the US considered giving up subsidies?
Yes, it would. There's quite a few dimensions in terms of answering the question. First of all, the amount of one of the things I discovered yesterday, that there's obesity in developing countries, and that's due to poor nutrition as much as anything else. We have obesity in the developed countries, industrial developed countries, and then again, it's the question of waste, and there's massive food waste in both developing and less developing countries. But what eventually you're getting onto is behaviour. And as populations increase their standard of living, there will be a demand for meat and dairy products. Now, I don't know how you're going to stop that. And where the Crawford Fund concentrates, and where ACR concentrates in this country, of course, is on the very poor, the poorest. And there, I suggest that those people will have to continue to feed themselves quite a long time. So they're not going to get into rump steaks for a very long time.
Okay, let's move to another question. Gentleman over here.
Yeah, my question's to the ABC presenter here.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I hope you can answer it for me. I'm not sure whether you're just trying to stir the discussion along, or
that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
whether
Trying
you
to
are
stir the discussion along.
An ABC view, and I cannot make that decision. Because
well, you should be assured that my job here is to stir the possum
you've trotted
and
out
to
all
ask
the
questions.
buzzwords of the crazy anti-science green movement.
No,
starting
I am
with
here.
industrial scale agriculture, GM, low input agriculture.
Can I just make a revelation to you? I'm married to a large-scale farmer on a traditional family farm.
Well, my
I
question
bet you weren't expecting that.
changes a little bit. When is the media going to stop pandering to the anti-science view of a lot of the fringe groups and present a more balanced argument on many of these issues that you've stirred on
Okay,
today?
look, I am here to facilitate
When is the media going to
discussion.
stand up to this?
I'm here to facilitate discussion, so I'm going to turn those questions over to the members of the panel, and particularly to you, Elizabeth Finkel, as a member of the media.
Well, it's challenging as a member of the media and it's also challenging for me as a former scientist to. I expect that when people make arguments, they're based on evidence. So it's challenging. And a lot of the NGO arguments are not at all based on evidence. But occasionally you will get a controversy like the recent one where we had a French scientist, Gilles Seralini, who published a paper in a refereed journal showing that GM corn caused cancers. And, okay, well, what do I do here? All my criteria for how I evaluate evidence are, challenged here. Okay, he's published in a refereed journal. He's a bona fide scientist from a bona fide university. Well, there must be something to this. But it was very strange. I don't know if you remember when that report came out. It was splashed across all the media headlines. John Fain had Scott Kinnear on, and asking him all these questions about the study, and Scott Kinnear knew all about it. But where was the scientist to be interviewed? And where were the scientists in any of the media? Well, it turned out Gilles Seralini did a very crafty deal with the world's media. He sent out this press release saying, this breakthrough study, I'm the first one in the world to ever feed rats for their whole lifespan, and we know cancer is a long-term disease, and now I've shown that indeed rats do get cancer, unlike all the other thousands of studies that haven't shown this. But the only way you're going to get my scoop is if you sign a confidentiality agreement. You're not allowed to show or discuss my data with any other scientist. So all the world's media said, yeah. And it was, anyway, the next day we get the backlash. And many of the world's major scientists, many of the world's major statisticians who know nothing about agriculture had a look at this paper and laughed. None of it was supportable, and indeed a year later it was retracted. But in terms of the media, and I actually sent an email to John Fain and said, are you now going to get Rick Rausch or some scientist on your show to comment? And he said, sorry, the media cycle has moved on. So very shrewdly, that story got the limelight, and who cares about the next day stories? So I'm sure that quite a few people watching this, or maybe in the audience, will truly believe that GM corn causes these outrageous cancers in the rats.
I think that poses a question about whether science needs to communicate better, and that goes to all the issues we've been discussing. Catherine?
Yes, I remember in the late 90s talking to some people from the American soybean industry saying, you're missing the boat about promoting your product, and particularly as it relates to GMO, because at the time, my view anyway, was in the US, there wasn't controversy over this food at all. So from the American industry perspective, it was, well, this food is fine, it's fine, it's fine. But in Europe, the controversy was stirring and brewing, and Europeans are much more passionate about their food than Americans are, I think. So even any little suggestion made people even more aggressive about what these things were. And then, of course, there were the trade issues and just the normal European/American issues that were bubbling up. And I was saying back then, the industry has to be more aggressive about getting the word out about your product. And I really think for a long time it was ignored, and so it's gotten to be that the opposition has become very strong and very articulate. And still, I don't think the industry is as strong as it could be explaining the positive benefits. And thanks to all of the wonderful words that you spoke, not only now but in your speech to the Crawford Fund Symposium, because you bring out a lot of these issues that many people do not.
And Catherine, Bertini, to that, although really my job here is to facilitate questions, I would say that science needs to be willing to answer questions, not to presume that they are being able to sell their answers to the public without having to prove that to the public, to have those discussions with the public, and to engage widely with the public through the prism of the media, perhaps. John Kerin, you want to comment?
Yeah, well, as a former politician, I'm a statesman now, but you'd understand my feelings about the media. But the reality is that fear and controversy sells, rational debate doesn't. And many of the organisations I've been involved in with scientists, including the CSIRO, where we had a specialist person who could actually boil science down so people can understand it. Because one of the problems of scientists themselves facing the media is that there is so much in their head that they know has been peer-reviewed and has been proven and proven and proven, and they just get irascible because of the ignorance of the questions being asked sometimes. So you have to have someone that can actually get it down into simple words. But you inevitably get beaten because of this whole fear thing. And the more serious the debate, the more they want the contrarian view. I understand where Tony was coming from when he took you on, but I far prefer the ABC with big ideas and the science show and there's always bias program by program in all media. If media's being partisan is not enough with media. Partisan is on one hand, on the other hand. But if it's not objective, it is subjective, and most of it is subjective. And I would far prefer what our national broadcaster does to endless talkbacks and shock jocks and all the rest of it, the lowest common denominator.
Let's continue discussing world hunger, and if we can get the microphone down here, I think.
Genevieve, I've got it
sorry.
here.
Oh, sorry, Mike. Hello. Yes, go on.
Thank you, panel. Michael Croft. I'm the Australasian delegate to the Committee on World Food Security at the UN. And the question I've got is this. In 2008, the world produced enough food for 12 billion people, according to the UN Special Rapporteur, and on the right to food. So what makes the panel think that adding another 70% to production, which would take world production to some 19 billion, enough food for 19 billion, what makes you think that that would then get to the 872 million chronically malnourished people? Is it not a question of social justice, equity and distribution. And politics? And politics. So it's not about what Professor Tim Lang calls productionism, which requires science and so forth, but it's more about social justice, equity, distribution and politics. Thank you.
Okay. Catherine Bertini, you
Sure.
first.
Well, it's an access issue, no question about it. And as your question suggests, you can't just take the volume of food that's grown and divided by the number of people and say, okay, everybody has enough to eat, because there are people who are not have access to food because they are too poor, because they are not anywhere near a food system that they can reach. An interesting point about those, the numbers though, and not getting to the human beings, but to those numbers, is that as the world population has doubled since 1970, that number has remained relatively the same. I mean, it's gone up and down, but it's still relatively the same. So in other words, the number of desperately hungry people did not double along with the population. Why? Because of economic development, because more people have more access to income and therefore can purchase or grow their own food. How do we reach those people just because we grow more food? You're right, not necessarily because there is more food. But the need to grow more food is not only the increased population, but the increased needs because of increased income. Reaching those people requires often change in government policies and certainly change in infrastructure at certain levels to be able to, for people who are desperately poor to be able to access.
John Kerin?
Yes, the first question also was a bit this way. One of the things that came out of the conference yesterday on this whole area of free trade, now it would be good if we had freer world trade, but there's a lot of trade barriers between developing countries. Now, luckily that's there are signs that's breaking down. In terms of the industrially developed world, I think we face more of a distribution problem, a price spike problem. There's all sorts of things happening in finance. There's hedge funds coming into commodities. But if we had freer trade, and I think what the current government's on about aid for trade and aid to enable developing countries to trade, that will help some of the developing countries. So there are a lot of elements in some of these propositions being put forward. What I like is all the thought that's going into it so we can help the poorest people. Because even though I'm starting to think the world doesn't face a really big food security problem in the immediate term. But the problem for the really hungry people and the not so hungry people but still hungry is still immense. So that's where we need to have the concentration.
Okay, here. Yeah.
Oh, could I?
Sorry,
Can I
go
just
ahead.
make a comment?
Yeah.
I sort of don't get this argument that you could pick up a wand and say, the world produces enough food. Okay, now Australia, you put your excess over there to Africa who needs it, and America, you do that too. And let's just, while we're at it, stop people eating meat. I mean, yes, if you could. Meantime, those sort of arguments I see being used to say, don't advance science and technology, don't develop GM techniques, just let's fix the waste, let's fix distribution, and you don't, let's forget about GM. And I just, well, where's the magician who's going to do that? Meantime, I see people like TJ Higgins from CSIRO, who spent the last 10 years developing, at the invitation of an African group, cowpea, genetically modified cowpea. Poor African farmers can't afford meat, so they eat this high protein indigenous crop, which is very drought tolerant, but it's very susceptible to predation by a particular kind of moth. And he, after years and years and years, he's finally developed a GM cowpea. It's got the same BT gene that is now in corn and soybeans, and it will be released. But who knows how many years it will take to get past this opposition that is being wielded by the anti-GM movement. Africa now, the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, they've decided we've had enough of being left behind by the technologies that have helped Asia develop a lot of food self-sufficiency, and they're exploring a raft of different types of crops. And they have no bias. Yes, well, as far as they can, because there is so much European imperialistic pressure to stop them from developing GM. But their mandate is to say, well, we're just going to try everything. We're going to try GM corn, we're going to try traditional corn, we're going to try everything. This is our country. We have to feed ourselves. We actually can't rely on Australia to send its excess or America to send its excess. And by the way, most of our people are really poor farmers. They need good seeds, they need good technologies to get them out of this romanticised subsistence organic lifestyle. So that's where I see realism, and I don't see how these arguments work. Well, let's just wave a magic wand and restructure the world.
Okay.
African scientists are probably in some of the most awkward positions of any of us because of these restrictions on using GMO, especially from European countries, and scientists are saying, wait, look at what Brazil is doing, look at what India is doing, look at what China is doing. Are we going to be left behind again?
And let's move on. We've got microphone here and then a question.
Jenny Goldie from Sustainable Population Australia. Norman Borlaug's been mentioned. Now, Norman said in his Nobel Prize winning speech that he was extremely concerned about overpopulation and that the Green Revolution was only buying time. Now, as has just been said, population has doubled since that time. And we've still got population growth, global population growth of about 80 million a year. And as we heard yesterday, it could head up to 16 billion by the end of the century. Now, yesterday and today we've heard all about supply, and I'm all in for increasing supply, but we're not hearing about demand, about reducing, or not reducing, but stabilising population so that we don't have more mouths to feed. Now, the population growth rate is coming down, but in some places like the Sahel, it's very high still, and that's associated, in those countries, with very high levels of hunger, very often. Dr. Bertini, clearly one of the ways of reducing population growth rates is to invest in women. We heard yesterday that investing in women in agriculture is one way of investing in women. Do you think that's enough to bring birth rates down and stabilise population?
No. The most important if we could do one thing in the world, have one development agenda, it should be to be sure that every girl in the world has at least a primary school education. That will make the difference. And the reason why it makes it makes a difference on the population side is because a girl who has education through age 10 or 12 has half as many children as her sister who is not educated.
Okay, yeah, here.
Right. Thank you very much. Walter Yanner, Healthy Soils Australia. Aren't we perhaps missing the key issue, which is actually the nutritional integrity of the food that we eat and have got access to? John mentioned earlier that there's basically 2 billion people who have got micronutrient deficiencies, obesity over 1 billion, and as we say, we've still got roughly 1 billion malnourished. The nutritional content of our food is now perhaps a third of what it was pre-Second World War because of the practices. It's a major contributor to the $145 billion a year disease industry we're perpetuating in Australia, for example. So the question is, when are we going to start focusing on the actual integrity, the quality of that food, its health effects, rather than just production?
John Kerin, quality versus quantity.
This one always has me stumped. I chair the CRC Soils and Land Management, and I think what Walter says is very true. How we can really trigger developing our soils in Australia a whole lot better with the existing agricultural systems, I really don't know. I can't see it being done in terms of broad acre. We've got about 15.8 million areas potentially under crops. If I look at the dairying industry, I think the soils are being improved there, but I'm not quite sure. Horticulture, they tend to be improving the soils, but to get soils improved across the board seems to me to be a heck of a problem. My problem is I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert on this, and I would really hope that we've got a few soil scientists in this audience that might be able to answer that one better. But as I said at the start, that's one that has me stumped. The Crawford Fund's thinking of looking at soils. We know how vital soils are. Soils and energy are two questions that we need to look at all the time. We can develop alternative energy, but at what cost? Population is the really big one. I think there's limits to how much of the world's the world's resources can be turned into human biomass, but I don't know what the limit is. I don't know what the timescale is on climate change before it dramatically affects our populations. These are some of the really big issues. And again, I can only see a way to go through it in terms of education and research.
It's a particularly pertinent question for us here with our depleted old soils in Australia and the kinds of discussions we've been having about whether we can increase our own food productivity. But Catherine Bertini?
Sure, and note, I've heard in the last few days being here, there's a lot of discussion about increased productivity in Australia. Australia is not alone, and the Western countries who have been very productive have now a smaller level of increase than the developing countries that haven't been productive before, and of course where the biggest population growths are. I want to get to obesity and the diet issues too. I think one way to address the under and over nutrition issues with governments is to show the cost. And I don't think there's been enough of this in countries up until now. But if you can show the cost of what obesity means, and you made a reference to this in your question, to the country in terms of the disease and therefore the medical cost that the country is undertaking because people are so much more obese. I think that is one way to try to get the issue addressed. But that's got obviously that makes it a national issue. I think on not only national but international issue, when we address malnutrition, which means bad nutrition, over and undernutrition, then we really need to be thinking about the intersection of agriculture and health. And in most countries around the world, these are silos. Here's agriculture and here's health, and they don't talk to each other. Well, nutrition happens to be something that is the intersection of the two. And I think that public policy people and anyone interested in how their governments operate need to insist that there is a strong intersection on a policy perspective between the two. Schengen Fen from IFPRI said at the conference yesterday that he thought agriculture ministers should be responsible and accountable for nutritional outcomes of the people in their countries. Somehow we've got to have these communities working together on policies. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to ultimately address the nutrition issue adequately.
Elizabeth Finkel, what do you think about the quality of modern food by comparison with the past and the effects that much more efficient production systems have had on the quality of what we produce?
Okay, well, I'm going to read to you what I read to the conference yesterday. There's a very interesting paper you should all have a look at, published in Nature in 2010 by James Vaupel, who's a demographer at the Max Planck Institute. So he had a look at human lifespans in 3 countries, let's see, the US, Sweden and Japan, since 1950, which sort of coincides with the rise of industrial agriculture. And there's a very interesting thing that you see. Before 1950, lifespan is going up like kind of slowly. After 1950, it's going up like this. And so what he says is, this graph shows no signs of slowing down. Between 1950 and 2000, the average lifespan for a woman went from 70 to 80. And so the rate of increase now is something like 2.5 years per decade. So really, 50 is the new 40. And it's not that people are piling up like junk in nursing homes. Senescence or old age is being delayed. They're reaching old age in better health. So I know there are many factors that contribute to increasing longevity, but if modern food was so detrimental to our health, please explain.
Okay.
These ageist comments. What's the new 77?
67.
Okay, we'll go, up here.
Thank you. Stepping carefully around the GMO minefield, which I think we could have a good argument about, but let's go to something that is inexplicable. Why are we diverting good growing land for the production of methanol and other biofuels when there is absolutely no greenhouse benefit, and when you take into account the capital involved in the production, it seems to me madness when that same food or that same land could be grown, or could be growing food for the people of the world.
John Kerin, what are your thoughts?
Well, all I can say is the market in the developed world, in the developing world. The world's biggest sugar producers are in the developing world, and Brazil's the world's biggest methanol producer, and or is it ethanol? But I have no answer.
Okay.
Other than the market.
Yeah, I think it's an extraordinary question. Elizabeth?
I mean, everything I read is people agree, you know, totally. But I think the next generation of biofuels are going to be interesting, where you don't use the food part of the plant, but you use the stalks, or so all the leftovers, you use that for biofuel, or you use land that is just not good for farming.
Put it back in the soil.
And just this year there was a significant publication on a new technique to break down the lignin, which is the main barrier to using these other sorts of biofuels in an efficient way. So I think that's what we have to look to.
Follow up from you.
Thank you. The point about biomass is excellent, and one of the major resources that is currently underutilised is the waste product from the ever-increasing population. And it seems to me that it's something that isn't in short supply. If we could get that back into the cycle of life, it would benefit our soils in many ways, and also avoid our current discharge to marine areas as the convenient method of disposal.
Yeah, and perhaps as much as anything, we're talking about valuing our agricultural land and its productivity and what it's got the capacity to do for it, rather than sort of feeding other industrial processes. But let's go to the question up the back here. Yeah, you've got the microphone.
Hi. You've talked a lot about genetically modified foods, and you've touched a bit on patenting. I was just wondering, the use of patenting in genetically modified foods largely drives the competition that is part of that industry.
Sorry, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Can you put the microphone a little closer? Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Sorry, I'll start again.
Yeah.
You've talked about genetically modified foods, and you've touched on the patenting involved in that industry. I was just wondering about the competition that's involved in that, and the impact that, because now you've talked about the European industry, yet large corporations now own life, and that has had kind of a detrimental effect on developing countries having access to particular strains of seeds, and developing their own industries in patenting, or in developing seeds. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Catherine Bertini, are you concerned about the global economic interplay that goes on there with controlling access to seeds and controlling access to the means of production?
Well, I think there's a bigger issue about controlling access to seeds, and that's national policies that limit seeds to be used for only seeds that have originated in that country to be used. For instance, in Ghana, recently the law was changed to allow seeds that were developed elsewhere to be able to be used in Ghana, because up until that time, it was very limiting for the farmers of Ghana. And this is not whether they're GMO or not. This is just any kind of seeds. It was kind of like a monopoly within Ghana, which is problematic to the farming in Ghana. And there are quite a lot of countries which still have these kind of restrictions. There's an organization in Africa, new organization called Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA. And one of the things that they are working on is to go country by country and review the laws relating to seeds in order to try to open up the process.
Yeah, indeed. Now, up here, yes.
Look, I was answering the chap who was talking about human waste recycling, who's now left, but having made a point. The fact is, this is already happening in developed countries, and in Sydney for at least 10 or 15 years, biosolids have been recycled onto agricultural land. They can only extend about 150 k's from Sydney because there's infinite capacity to absorb on our depleted soils. So that is a very important area as the world urbanises and there's more transfer of nutrients into the urban system, and systems of recycling have to be managed intensively. And in countries like China, where traditionally it was the practice in rural China, as espoused in old books like Farmers of 200 Centuries, written in the early 20th century, where all the human waste was recycled back onto the farmer's own field. Now, with the urbanisation of China accelerating, the soil depletion of basic nutrients is a massive issue that transcends anything about GM or organic or anything like that.
Thank you very much for contributing to that. That was terrific. Now, we've got, I can't see where the microphone is, up here. Yes, sorry, up the top there. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Heather and I'm a Crawford Scholar from Adelaide Uni. So I just wanted to put a bit of a different slant on things. I was reading the current edition of Cosmos magazine, and I read an interesting article on the psychological factors surrounding acceptance of GM, like loss aversion. And these seem to overshadow trust in scientific evidence sometimes. So what are some strategies that could be taken to approach GM acceptance from more of a psychological point of view? So changing people's mindsets instead of just throwing out cold, hard scientific facts. Thank you.
I think that's made for you, Elizabeth.
It's an interesting question and one I've wondered a lot about. Recent research, so-called cultural cognition, led by people like Dan Kahan at Yale, looks at how, the influences on people when they make decisions about things like climate change or GM or vaccination. I heard him speak last week and I saw a very disturbing graph that showed it really made no difference on the level of people's scientific education, it made absolutely no difference to their position on perception of risk from global warming. It all tracked on whether they voted Republican or Democrat. Similar graph on GM wasn't quite as extreme, although it tended to show that people who are more, Democrat thinking are more likely to think GMOs are a risk than Republicans. So this is very dismaying, this point of view that, I might as well just pack up and go home. There's no point. People aren't going to listen to evidence. They're not interested in evidence. But I just know that can't be true. There must be policymakers out there who, like every other system we've got in the legal system or whatever, who rely on evidence to make their decisions. I think in this debate, when you have huge organisations like Greenpeace, who doesn't love Greenpeace? They go out there to save the whales for you. When they have had this concerted campaign for years, what do you expect people to think? Why don't you ask Greenpeace? Ask them to explain how they continue to hold this position despite scientific evidence. They embrace scientific evidence when it comes to climate change. Why do they completely ignore it? Maybe that would be a fruitful way to approach this. Apart from that, I think you have to avoid being extreme and knee-jerk type responses because that just makes people clam up. I think you just have to try to address issues and questions point by point.
Okay, Catherine?
If people are more and more asking what's in their food, I think that the industry should talk more about it. Okay, you're a vegetarian, you like to eat tofu. Oh, did you know that it's been genetically modified? What about corn? Do you really like to have corn on the cob? Oh, well, guess where that comes from? I mean, I think that there's a lot of just basic, this is what we eat now. It's healthy, it's useful, and it's for years been genetically modified. I think more of that specific foods would help to educate the public. John?
I just want to make one point following on Helen's question. There's always choices, these things. Rather than circulate human waste, if I had my druthers, I'd be concentrating on clean water for the poor and toilet facilities. That'd be my first. I'm not saying a word against what you're saying, Helen, but I meant to say those are staggering problems for the world's least developed people.
We've got time for just a few more questions. Yes, in the middle here.
Hello, I'm Shomi from Charleston University. My question is related about the consumer perception, about the fresh fruits and vegetables in Australia, about how they look. So I come from India. So in India, getting a fruit or vegetable is more important than how it physically look, like it is good looking or it is having no problem. So do you think that consumer perception about that the physical outlook of fruits and vegetables in the supermarket, if that can be more progressive, then the waste would be reduced and people will be able to take more foods?
I think this goes again to that question about the imbalance that we have, the luxury which we expect for ourselves in this developed country, that we can choose carrots based on how attractive they look rather than whether they're good for us. Catherine?
Yeah, I think it's going to be harder to change what the buyers buy and put in the grocery stores in a Western market than actually using the quote unacceptable food for some other purpose. For instance, setting up a lot of places have set up a system where food banks get access to the food that the grocery store won't put out, and the markets will give them to the food banks to serve the poor, and that kind of approach may be a better way to deal with waste at this point.
Question up the back here. Yes?
Hi there. I'm a university student from the University of Western Sydney, and my question was just about the actual name of like GMO or GM crops. And it just seems like a bit of a blanket term, and I was wondering whether we should try and differentiate a bit more between, let's say, interspecies or intraspecies splicing, or just different sorts of tissue culture, like maybe more consumers would be a bit more open to it if we were just telling them, oh yeah, it's fine, this is just a gene from corn, we're just putting it into a different corn plant because it's easier that way.
And Elizabeth, that goes to those questions about communication, and it's a very important point that what the general public generally understands about genetically modified food is in fact a wide variety of techniques. Some of them more complex and different to others. There are a whole range of things that we're talking about under one banner, and perhaps that's not a helpful banner.
I'm not sure it would really make much difference. In the end, DNA is just a sequence of 4 letters. And a lot of times the gene you put in, yes, they may have gotten the idea from a different species, but they just synthesize it in the lab. An interesting question at the moment is that there is a new method of genetically modifying where you don't put any new gene in, you just do the equivalent of editing. It's a technique called CRISPR, which has taken the genetic modification world by storm. And the proposition is, well, if you genetically modify crops with this method, you're not actually putting in any new DNA, you're just taking stuff away, or you're just doing a little bit of editing with what's already there. Let's just put that over there. Could this possibly duck the bullet? It might actually, as it stands, it would not need to go through the regulatory process. So it could save companies, small companies who also like to develop GM products, could save them $500 million in having to go through all the safety testing. And would that possibly be more acceptable to the public? And I doubt it, because until you get some of these huge organisations that people just recognise as equivalent with public good, like the NGOs, until you make them accountable for their statements, you're going to have a huge uphill battle. And I'd like to make that point. I mean, a lot of organisations are held accountable. Food safety organisations are accountable. What accountability is there for these huge NGO organisations for their statements to hold up to fact and evidence?
I think we'll go for our last question, which is up here. Yep.
Dennis Blight from the Crawford Fund. I'd like to ask a question to John Kerin, and it's not a Aunt Sally, a Dorothy Dixer. I just wonder if part of the solution isn't the target for your communications plan. We now learn that the Hawke-Keating era, along with the Howard era, were 2 of the golden eras of Australian policymaking, and I think I probably agree with that. How do you build that bipartisanship amongst politicians and policymakers on some of these core issues that really matter? Setting aside climate change for the moment, but because that ship might have sailed, as someone said, but on things like GM, if you can build a bipartisan support amongst policymakers based on sound science and good communications, surely you won't have to worry about Greenpeace. Politicians worry about getting elected, and on these core issues, which are so important, we need bipartisan support. Fortunately, in Australia, we have bipartisan support for investment in international agricultural research. That's clear. We need more of that on some of these key core issues. I was sparked by the startling evidence about the demographic in the United States, where Republicans believe this and Democrats believe that. Let's get them both believing the same thing on the big issues.
John Kerin.
Well, now we're gone back to the pre-Enlightenment, and and we're into slogan implementation. It'd be too long an answer. We haven't got time to go into all the elements of it. The past always looks a bit better. But at base, well, I don't think the Tea Party is going to be the answer to that approach, and we're heading for a bit of that, because that's nonsense. But the big problem is we can't get rational debate between the political parties now. This is a very small country in terms of population. Great damage has been done to the Australian public service back away, to be quite honest, in the Howard years. And we're constantly dragging down the intellectual capacity of the public sector. And yet we really need a strong, we're over-governed to hell, but we can't do much about that because we're a federation. But you really do need a strong Australian public service. A lot of that's gone. And we keep on taking money out of the university sector. So a lot of the intellectual capacity is gone. And the political parties have become, the two major political parties, have become cabals in their own right, and that's part of the problem. So it's always fighting for a middle ground, which is increasingly the lowest common denominator. Now, it's all right for an old politician like me to say that, but what the hell do you do about it? You know, there are two political classes. By and large, the Labor Party, about last government, if you could call it that, they had about 2/3 came from union background or former ministers' office. Liberal Party's about 40% business and liberal. People don't understand even nowadays, from what I can see, the difference between having a market-based approach to government or a business approach to government. Everyone thinks it's the same thing. No, it's not. If you're sort of having a market-based approach to government, you're actually trying to stimulate competition to the benefit of the consumers. Now, if you have a business-based government, well, it's going to be all about looking after business. But, you know, that's a very keen distinction, but I think everyone thinks it's the same thing, and it's not. So we are more and more dealing in cliches and slogans, and the last parliament was toxic. And it wasn't just caused by Tony Abbott. He was very clever just to get into government on a handful of slogans. He probably didn't even have to say a thing. But where does that leave the people who really just simply, they don't want to vote for labels anymore? Why would young people join political parties? People just want to vote for good government, but they don't see it from either side now. And at base, I think, Dennis, it's because there is no rational reason to debate much anymore. So most of my generation politicians, or statesmen in my case, we are quite dismayed because we don't know what we can do about it.
We'll leave it with the senior statesman.
I've always been a pessimist, folks, so don't...
We'll leave it with senior statesman John Kerin. And our panellists this afternoon, John Kerin, Catherine Bertini and Elizabeth Finkel. Please thank them very much.
Yes, I very much want to thank our panel for the stimulating comment and discussion that they've engendered today. I want to thank you, the audience, for the questions which have brought together a wonderful discussion today, and I thank Genevieve for her steering that discussion along so expertly. This has been recorded, so it will be available. I think you'll be all provided with a link to be able to get at the recording of the session today, and I hope that you make use of that. So thank you all very much for attending, and hopefully you can come along to one of the next 4 topical science fora that we'll be running. Thank you.